Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. In today's special episode, we sat down with Alex Gray, Senior Fellow of the American Foreign Policy Council, and Grant Newsham, Senior Fellow with the Center for Security Policy. They touch on the Asia czar Kirk Campbell's recent comments on China posing a strategic surprise in the Pacific, the importance of the islands in the region, and what this means going forward. Let's dive in. Thank you so much for joining us today. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks very much. Glad to be here.
So it seems the Pacific is getting a lot of attention right now, right? Taiwan is in the spotlight with the Indo-Pacific and the First Island chain. But Kirk Campbell, who many consider as the Asia czar, recently made some comments saying China poses a, quote, strategic surprise. So why would he say that? What's your take on that?
I disagree with Dr. Campbell on the fact that we should be surprised about what's going on in the second island chain. To me, there's nothing surprising about it. We've watched for years now as China has attempted to expand its reach in the Pacific Islands, the islands of Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia. And we've seen it manifested in a number of ways. China's attempted, publicly acknowledged, that they're attempting to get military access in places like Papua New Guinea, in Fiji, in Vanuatu, in other parts of the Pacific. We know this. This isn't a surprise. This isn't a secret. This is all publicly available information. We know that with the Belt and Road Initiative, China is making tremendous strides in bringing additional Pacific Island countries under their economic umbrella, and they're using that leverage to exert control, political control, diplomatic control, potentially even military leverage over countries who've gotten themselves in terrible debt. We saw a comment just this week from a senior Chinese official who pointed out that Tonga had very few options in the aftermath of its horrible disaster because of how much of their debt is owed to China. We also, in terms of what might constitute a surprise and shouldn't, we've seen just how much China has exerted itself to try and switch diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to China across the Pacific Islands. A couple of years ago, there were 6 countries that recognized Taiwan. Now there are 4 because China ran an incredibly aggressive campaign to coerce the Solomon Islands and Kiribati to change recognition, and they succeeded. So none of this is a surprise. None of this is new. This is well known to American officials. When I was at the National Security Council, we were aware of it and we worked on it every day. So really, my concern is that if we're viewing this as a strategic surprise, we're woefully unprepared then to deal with the information that really should already be apparent to the White House and to the rest of the U.S. government.
Apparently what he was talking about was the possibility of the Chinese actually setting up a military base or a military presence in one of these islands. The one he may have been talking about was Kiribati, which is south of Hawaii. Americans would know it as Tarawa. The Marines fought a bloody battle to take it back in 1943. And the Chinese are talking, well, they've have recently got the Kiribati government to switch recognition from Taiwan to the PRC. And now the Chinese are talking about refurbishing a World War II era airfield in Kiribati, and it's on an island that has it's going to be for tourism, of course. The island itself has a population of 25, like 25 people. And this is a taste of what America's probably going to discover in the coming years. Kirk Campbell, it seems to recognize it, along with the rest of the government. But if anyone is surprised by this, they were hiding in the bathroom for the last 20 years. This should not be a surprise. The fact that it is mentioned as a possible surprise really does not instill much confidence in some observers like me. And you'll also notice in his comments that he made, he describes the problem kind of, but nowhere is there any mention of what the plan is to deal with it, to take on this Chinese influence campaign in the heart of the Central Pacific. And that seems to, the plan, it's either doesn't exist or else it's considered a state secret, apparently. But I get the impression that nobody quite knows what to do about it on the U.S. government side.
And so you brought up the second island chain. So it seems the first island chain would be like Taiwan, Japan, the Philippines. So what is the second island chain and why is it so important?
So the second island chain is basically Oceania, the islands that stretch through Guam, Micronesia, down through Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu, down towards Australia and New Zealand. And historically, if you look at the importance of these islands, really all you have to do is go back to World War II. And these are the islands that Japan made a tremendous effort to militarize, to colonize, to fortify, and that a tremendous amount of blood and treasure was expended by the Americans and our allies to liberate these islands in World War II. Strategically, they're so important because if you're thinking about with the United States military needing access to East Asia, whether the scenario is a hypothetical scenario involving Taiwan, a scenario involving Japan, a scenario involving the Korean Peninsula, we have to have the ability to supply our forces in the region from the West Coast and from Hawaii, primarily by ship. And in order to do that, we have to pass through the islands that comprise that second island chain you mentioned. And so it's so important, and this is why it's so concerning that China has expressed interest in military bases across that second island chain, because we have to have unfettered access to get our troops, our ships, our aircraft, our supplies through those islands. And so really, it's, I would say, one of our highest strategic priorities in the Pacific since World War II, and including now, is to ensure that those islands remain free and open for the U.S. and our allies to access East Asia.
You've mentioned the first island chain, and that is effectively, it's a chain of islands that stretch from Japan down to Taiwan, to the Philippines, down to Indonesia and Malaysia. And effectively, if you look at the map, it blocks off the Chinese People's Liberation Army, the Chinese military, when it's trying to get out into the Pacific. So it's really a defense line, and Taiwan is right in the middle of it. And obviously, if the middle of your defense line falls, that the other side has really free access into the Pacific. But that hasn't happened yet. So what the Americans are really thinking is to kind of defend along that first island chain. And that's sort of the front of America's defenses. Obviously, if you have the front of your defenses, you also have a rear, a behind of your defenses. And what the Chinese have done very cleverly over the last 20, 30 years, really, is to establish themselves in practically every island in the Pacific, to including American territories. So what they've done is they've got this presence, which is in the rear of America's defenses. So it's really right, if you look at the map, and you have to look at a map to really understand all of this, is that China has got a presence, a foothold, in nearly every island in the Central Pacific, the South Pacific, the Southwest Pacific, and as far as the west coast of Latin America. So while America's defending forward, China is popping up in the rear. And you don't have to have been in the military to understand what the problem there is. And that is what they have very effectively done, is starting with commercial presence, getting Chinese people into these islands, running small businesses, taking over, dominating the main industries, say the fishing industries, for example. And commercial presence and power equals political power, and particularly as the Chinese go to work paying bribes and offering investments that sound very attractive, that they win over parts of these island societies. You don't have to have everything, you just have to have enough. And there is a pro-China constituency in just about every Pacific island on the map. And so that is the problem facing the United States.
So why is Beijing going after the second island chain? It almost sounds like it's trying to circumvent the first island chain, which has a lot of U.S. presence. All our allies are there. So what's your take on that?
Well, I think it's a very shrewd strategic move. And if you look at historically, if you take a map of where Imperial Japan had its military bases before and during World War II, and you overlay that with where China has publicly expressed interest in gaining military access, it's almost the exact same location. Sometimes it is literally the exact same location. Manus Island in Papua New Guinea is one example where literally the Japanese had a base before and during World War II, and we know that China publicly attempted to get a base before the US and Australia were able to head that off. So, we know that historically having that access is critical to being able to project power throughout the region and also being able to deny access to your competitor. So what's so strategically shrewd about it is if the United States is attempting, as you say, we have these interests in East Asia, we have forces throughout the first island chain, we have to resupply those forces. We have to have the ability to bring in the logistics, the materiel, the equipment to supply our troops in Japan and Korea and Guam. So what's so critical is being able to move seamlessly across the Pacific without having the access to those forces denied. And if China is able to gain a presence in any of the second island chain, it makes it very complicated for the United States to maintain our posture in East Asia.
These islands may be very small in geographic terms, but in terms of strategic importance, they are immensely valuable. I would cite the American diplomatic presence. We don't have embassies in all that many places. Recently, there was trouble in the Solomon Islands, which made the news. And the Solomon Islands are strategic terrain. They were hotly fought over in World War II as well. You'd think, well, the American embassy in the Solomon Islands, they're on top of things and they'll keep things under control. But America doesn't have an embassy in the Solomon Islands. It's covered by somewhere else, I think New Guinea. Kiribati, which I just mentioned, once again, there's no U.S. embassy there. There'll be all sorts of excuses why we can't, or there's not enough diplomats, et cetera, there's not enough money, but there's foreign service officers lined up to get to Vienna, to get to London and Paris and Brussels, but not so much to the Central Pacific, which is no less important. So if you were somehow to make the service where say a young officer on the make wants to go to make a name for himself and is rewarded appropriately, that might be a start. But we have seen, as I would point out, that there have been, there's some successes which show what's possible. They're small successes, but they're important nonetheless. And I would cite the island nation of Palau, which is to the east of the Philippines. It's actually, it has a special relationship with the United States, whereby the Americans take care of Palau's defenses, as they do with Micronesia and the Marshall Islands. But Palau, a year and a half ago or so, asked the Americans to set up a military base in Palau. And that took some real courage by the president of Palau, but also the U.S. ambassador there. Really deserves a lot of credit. He's got a tiny staff, but really through, I think, and I'll bet this is the case, through his initiative, his hard work, that he was able to bring this about. And it shows what can be done when the right person is the right people are in the right places. But you will notice that while this offer has been made, and the president of Palau has put himself in the Chinese crosshairs by taking this stance, the American military has not moved out very quickly on this. Instead of just taking up the offer and getting something going, it really hasn't done all that much. You don't see that sense of urgency, I'm afraid, on the U.S. side.
And so since these islands are so important, what can the U.S. do? Like, what are some actionable steps that could be implemented?
Well, first of all, we have the luxury of a great relationship with Australia, with New Zealand, with Taiwan, with Japan, with France, who have a substantial presence in the region. All those countries have their own individual relationships, their own histories in the islands. So as a unified group, we have a lot of leverage in the region. So I think that's important, that this doesn't just need to be a United States effort. I would say the number one thing we have to do is the relationship we have with what are called the freely associated states, the three countries of Micronesia, the Federated States of Micronesia, Palau, and the Marshall Islands. they have what's called a compact of free association with the United States. It's a very special agreement that we have, which allows the U.S. to have unfettered military access to all three countries. We provide for their defense, and in exchange, we provide them some level of economic assistance and some special concessions. But those relationships, because of the strategic location of those three islands, those relationships are absolutely paramount to U.S. national security and to our presence and our posture in the Indo-Pacific. All three were significant battlefields in World War II. They have extremely strong cultural ties to the United States. The citizens of all three countries serve in the U.S. military at very high rates. Those agreements are expiring in the next 2 years. I would say the highest priority of the U.S. government in the Pacific right now should be ensuring that those agreements are renewed. They're renewed quickly, and the Congress approves them and appropriates the funding to see that those agreements are implemented as soon as humanly possible. The signal that it would send to the region if those agreements continue to languish is extremely negative, and it would give China an opening, not just in those three countries, but more broadly would send a signal of U.S. disinterest in the region. So I've urged the Biden administration to continue its predecessor's work and make sure that those agreements are immediately renewed. The other thing, more broadly speaking, of what we can be doing in the region, the U.S. has very few embassies in the Pacific Islands, in the second island chain. The U.S. should be expanding its embassy presence to the Solomon Islands, to Vanuatu. We should have consulates or embassies in places like Kiribati, in Nauru and Tuvalu, in Tonga. It's so important that, as great as our allies and partners are in Australia and New Zealand and Taiwan and Japan and France, we have to be on the ground ourselves. There's no substitute for American leadership on the ground, providing our perspective and being able to inform our policymakers of what our diplomats are seeing day to day. So I think there's a lot that we could be announcing. There's a lot we could be doing, and it's just going to take some leadership from Washington.
Well, first you have to be there. And as I mentioned, you've got to have an adequate diplomatic presence all over the place. And you can't say, well, we'll just leave it up to the Australians or we'll leave it up to the New Zealanders. The Americans need to be there on their own right. And if you're not there, you're not interested. And it is about that simple. So that permanent presence is the important thing. Then you need a military presence as well. The U.S. military shows up once in a while and puts on a show, kind of like the Harlem Globetrotters. And it's entertaining, but if you're not there all the time, as I said, you're not interested. There's a vacuum, and vacuums get filled. And so also there's a need for sort of more commerce, more Western and or Japanese and Taiwanese commerce in the area. That takes some clever thought to actually make that happen. But with the right guarantees and, as I say, the right approach, you can attract a certain amount of business into the area. If there's no American business there, well, the Chinese are going to fill the void. But it can be done, but it's not really something most diplomats know much about, even if they are supposed economic specialists. But there are some people who know that. Also, realize that having the Pacific Islands on side, and particularly the three so-called COFA states, these are the ones that have that special arrangement with the Americans that lets the Americans handle their defense, which means the Americans can exclude any other military from their territory, and we have the right to operate there. That is priceless. And as part of the agreement the Americans have with these islands, it's that we will provide, in exchange for them giving us the sort of the military control of the area, that we provide money. And we provide the right to live in the United States and some other benefits. But there's a financial contribution that the Americans make to these islands, which don't have great commercial opportunities, but American money is very helpful for them, and it's part of the deal. And the Americans don't seem to value that as much as they should. And in particular, the COFA agreements are coming up for renegotiation. And in fact, they're supposedly being renegotiated now. the Americans are playing very hard to get, trying to drive a really tough bargain with these states or nations, instead of saying, what do we need to do to get this signed tomorrow? That for some reason, America does not seem to be prioritizing these agreements or the renewal of them. It is being incredibly stingy, and it doesn't seem to have assigned its A-team to the negotiations. I don't know of a nicer way to put it. Nor does it seem to be, a high priority, and that's really something that the Asia czar bears responsibility for. So, you need to show that you actually give two hoots about these places and treat these people like you actually respect them. It's amazing, actually, that the COFA states, Marshalls, Micronesia, and Palau, actually still like us. I'm only half joking, because I'll bet you that every leader in that country has been offered a blank check by the Chinese, and yet they have stuck with us, as they have for a long time. And we really need to value that more, the amounts of money we're talking about to spend in the COFA states, but throughout the region.
And is there anything else you'd like to add?
We're in an extremely perilous moment in the region writ large, with the China-U.S. competition on all fronts: economic, military, political, the threats that are being made against Taiwan on a daily basis. It's a really dangerous moment. And we're also seeing in the Ukraine situation just how much the perception of U.S. weakness and the perception of a lack of U.S. leadership has global implications. And so what maybe in Washington sometimes appears to be a separate issue, oftentimes in the minds of our competitors and our adversaries is linked. I think it's really important, getting back again to Dr. Campbell's comments about a strategic surprise. Nothing that we're doing or not doing in the Pacific and the second island chain should be viewed as somehow disconnected from our larger strategy vis-a-vis China. China's watching all of it. Beijing calculates all of it. They think about our actions or our inactions as part of a broader assessment of U.S. commitment to the region, U.S. commitment to Taiwan. All of it needs to be looked at holistically. And I hope that in the coming weeks and months, I hope that the administration will act very aggressively to shore up our presence in the region and to send the right signal about our long-term commitment to being what we've been for our entire history, which is a Pacific power.
You've got to have the permanent diplomatic presence there, which is influencing as well. And also do some decent propaganda in the original good meaning of the word and explain what America is doing. Because it spends a huge amount of money in the Pacific, actually far more than the Chinese do, but you would think it was vice versa. And that's because the Americans don't publicize what they do very well. The other aspect I said is get out the checkbook and spend money on these places, and particularly start with the money that is needed to keep the COFA agreements with the Central Pacific nations afloat. Keep these things intact, and also consider some COFA arrangements maybe with some of the other tiny island nations in the region. There are some opportunities there. And all these islands, they're very small, but if you look at their maritime territory, it's huge. And so that just takes a little imagination and some effort to make some deals with some other places. And bring the Japanese in. The Australians, we do work with them, but it needs to be done better, and it needs to be to get some better results than it has gotten. There's really no nice way to say it, but you do have to keep score and see how well we're doing, and then see how well the Chinese are doing. As far as Latin America goes, and that is the right half of the Pacific, my goodness, the Chinese have dug themselves in there very nicely, and nobody on our side seems to have taken it all that seriously. Or the ones who have, and particularly Southcom in the U.S. military structure, they've had some good ideas, but they haven't been listened to. So this is a challenge, and unfortunately, if it's considered a surprise that this has happened, you can see why we are in the spot we are. It's not too late. But it is, in baseball terms, probably the bottom of the seventh, and we're down by about 6 runs. So we've really do have to hurry on this.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
And for those just tuning in, that was today's special episode with Alex Gray, Senior Fellow of the American Foreign Policy Council, and Grant Newsham, Senior Fellow with the Center for Security Policy. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.